Today, we have Silvia D'Amelio. She's the Chief Executive Officer at Trout Unlimited. We're going to deal with conservation, and she's going to update us, and she's going to be a force with us. And I think we're going to have her back and do some tying another time if she's amenable to that, if that's okay.
I'm in.
All right.
So I'm going to approach today's conversation on conservation. I think I got to try that a few times fast after a bottle of wine. As more of a casual conversation, and I encourage you to jump in, and I encourage you to ask questions. This isn't a formal presentations with slide and all of those pieces, so you're going to be forced to look at the rest of the faces on the screen and have a conversation with us today. And so on that bent, what I wanted to talk to you first about was a little bit about the evolution of conservation and what it means. And you know, in our world, especially today, a lot of people confuse conservation and advocacy. And think they're sort of one and the same, and they very much aren't. And conservation is really about protections on the ground. In our world, it's about protections of aquatic systems. And that's really evolved over time. And I remember when I joined Trout Unlimited Canada almost 19 years ago. And prior to that, it was much more shocking, right, Jack? It was much more focused, you know, on local issues, local concerns, rebuilding local lost habitats, building habitat for specific animals, specific fisheries, rehabilitating with a specific ideal or goal in mind that was typically fisheries related. And that's not just for volunteer groups, that's really where a lot of government agencies were at as well. That's how management sort of had evolved to at that time. But conservation has evolved since then pretty dramatically in a lot of different ways, in people's perception of it and in the activity on the ground. And, you know, first, the activity on the ground to me has been really quite exciting in that there's been a shift and a move from, you know, let's get more of this specific type of fish in this area. Let's build, you know, this specific type of home for this specific type of fish, to really rehabilitating the form and function, that natural form and function of rivers, because I think we kind of all figured out Mother Nature can do it better than us any day of the week, given the chance. And so really what Trout Unlimited Canada is focused on is giving Mother Nature that opportunity to fix it. We just need to give her the tools to get the job done. And so there's been this move and change over time in how we approach conservation. Interestingly enough, on the volunteer and advocacy and local community side, there's been a similar evolution on a different sort of tangent, and that's around how conservation is perceived and viewed and how it's approached. And, you know, again, 20 years ago, we were talking about local issues, folks concerned about a local section of a local watershed, and dealing with conservation at that level. And over the last couple of decades, that's really rolled up, and you're seeing a lot more push and concern for regional issues, regional protections for water sources, water quality, to address issues within that local region. And so there's been this roll up over time, which is challenging for a lot of volunteer organizations and a lot of local groups, but speaks to, I think, a broadening education of how we really implement positive change on the ground, because that bigger picture really is necessary. But along those lines, somewhere, I'm not sure where, in that last 20 years, conservation and advocacy kind of did this thing where they became completely intertwined, and conservation in some people's minds is advocacy. It actually isn't. They're two very different things, and they can complement one another. There's no doubt about that, but they are two different things. And the reason that's really important for a group like Trout Unlimited Canada or any other registered charity is we're actually legally limited in how much advocacy by definition we can do. In other words, we do too much advocacy, we no longer exist. Government pulls our plug. And so that distinction between conservation and advocacy is really quite significant, especially in today's day and age. Now, I may have moved to Alberta, but I'm very aware of what's happening in Ontario. And it's not all that different from what's happening in Alberta as well, and a lot of the rest of the country. And so it's really important to understand the difference between those two pieces, the conservation and advocacy. And advocacy, by definition, is a movement to realize change at any government level. It's really about trying to get the government to change policy, legislation, change ideals, change direction, all of those pieces are advocacy and are really heavily regulated by CRA, by the Canada Revenue Agency, when it comes to not-for-profits and charities. Does that all make sense? And it seems like a lot of details, but trust me, it is important. As we move down a road with a changing landscape and the need for more protections on the landscape. And we've seen, and I know a lot of other organizations similar to ours, conservation organizations, have seen a real push and a real pressure placed on them to do more conservation. And what people are really asking for is a lot more advocacy. And the real challenge is that there really aren't advocacy groups for aquatic systems. Conservation groups cannot spend the majority of their time on advocacy just by definition. And realistically, you don't want them to. I mean, a group like Trout Unlimited Canada spends its time and money getting change done on the ground, actually making positive changes in streams and creeks and rivers and lakes across the country. And you still need groups doing that. Advocacy isn't enough, right? We still need the conservation and rehabilitation side of things. But if we actually think about it, there is this gap. There's this gap in advocacy that groups like Trout Unlimited Canada, you know, we can work a little bit in that realm, and we do, and we look for the biggest bangs for our buck in that area, but it's not where we can spend our time. Like I said, that 10% rule is pretty significant. And that's 10% of not only your funds, but your time, your energy, your efforts. It's 10% of your resources, period. And so unfortunately, because there's this gap when it comes to advocacy, the pressure is placed on groups like ours and other conservation groups to do that advocacy piece. So, you know, there may be a role at the provincial, regional, provincial, and national level for an advocacy group when it comes to aquatics. There's no doubt about that. Groups like Trout Unlimited Canada and others can play a role and can support other groups like that, but there's definitely a gap that we've identified there. You know, the political changes that we're seeing on the landscape, and I don't know about you, but for me, the last 5 years, politics has changed dramatically, especially in the last 3 years or so, changed dramatically. And that has played a significant role in the change in conservation and the need for conservation and advocacy in the country. I'm trying to figure out if it's just my perception, but certainly I saw an increasing interest in conservation, in preservation of critical habitats, sensitive habitats, endangered species, all these things that we've been talking about over a number of years. But over the last 3 years, it seems like that interest and that push is decreasing dramatically and disappearing entirely on the political stage. It's no longer a priority. And when you add COVID-19 on top of that, it's kind of understandable. How many fires can, you know, anyone in the public handle at any one given time? How many things can we expect a community to invest their efforts in fighting or advocating for in the middle of a pandemic? And so we run into problems not only with our politics, but also with our current situation with the pandemic and its impact on the general trend of conservation, especially in this country. And it's of great concern. You know, I don't know about the rest of you, but I took great pride in thinking that, you know, Canada was a leader in conservation, a leader in protections, that Canada at least had it right. We may not have been perfect, but we were heading in the right direction. But the more and more I dig in and the more I see what's happening on the landscape, the more disappointed I am. The fact that the EPA is now having very serious discussions with the government of BC regarding toxicity of materials coming out of their coal pits is of concern to me. I was terribly disappointed to think that the US had stronger water quality regulations than we did. And there was no reason for me to think that they didn't, but certainly it's an eye-opener for me. And I think it should be an eye-opener for every Canadian. We consider ourselves to take pride in our wild spaces and take pride in the health of our wild spaces. But the truth of the matter is we don't hold them in a high enough regard, and we don't offer them protections that they need for our own survival and for the generations following us. So I don't know about you guys, but that was a bit of a unfortunate eye-opener for me. But COVID-19 has significant impacts, not only on how individuals approach the world around them right now, but how conservation organizations approach the world around them. And, you know, in Canada, we are a very, very giving society. There's no doubt about that. When something happens, we give, and we give more than a lot of communities do. And so when you see things like the Fort Mac fires or the Broncos bus tragedy, when critical situations arrive, Canadians step up. We very much do, and we are very, very good in a crisis. Unfortunately, what we're not terribly good at doing in this country is dealing with an issue before it becomes a crisis. So something that is chronic, like the protection of our aquatic systems. This is not a new issue. And I know it's not a new issue because Isaac Walton was at the conservation forefront many years ago when I started. And you guys are cycling back. I would have loved for you guys to not have to cycle back. I would like to see we solve this problem, but we haven't. And we haven't afforded our resources in this country the protections they deserve. And what do I mean by that? I mean not only our fish, the water quality, the source water, the resources, the gravel, the structure of our rivers and streams and lakes, none of it. We have not afforded the protections that they need. And how do we know that? We're still listing species on the endangered species list in this country. If our regulations and our policies and our legislation were doing the job, we would not be adding species to the endangered species list. That to me is the barometer. That is the temperature gauge for me. If that's happening, we're losing already. So we've got a problem in this country, and it's not getting better with COVID. Because with COVID-19, this is our new crisis, and this is where the support now gets focused. Foundations have changed their priorities to focus on community support centers, medical centers, and rightly so. We need to support the eradication of COVID-19 in this country and support the communities that are at risk because of COVID-19. Absolutely. But that is where the focus is. That's where foundations are putting their focus. That's where donors in Canada are putting their focus. And so it becomes increasingly more difficult for organizations that are facing other challenges that may not be in the social sector or the health sector to keep afloat, to try and make sure that we're not creating a new crisis in the wake of the current crisis. And the fact of the matter is, in Canada, we have the knowledge and the resources to be able to tackle more than one crisis at a time. We absolutely do. We just haven't figured out how to do that yet. And it's time that we do. So COVID-19 also not only impacts the fundraising, but also impacts the operations. And a lot of people don't realize this. When I brought our 2021, if I can keep track of the years, our 2021 budget to the board of directors, they said, but why has travel gone up? Nobody's traveling. How's the budget for travel gone up? Well, for us to send people into the field, it's now an individual pickup truck for each field member because we have to be in separate vehicles. There's added costs in cleaning and sanitizing. There's masks, there's gloves, there's all these added costs. So the costs have actually gone up while the funds go down. And you're going to find this not just for Trout Unlimited Canada, but for all conservation organizations in the sector. By third quarter of last year, there was an estimate that 30% of charities had shut down. They couldn't actually maintain their operations with the loss of donations and funds from various sources like foundations and grants. And so you're starting to see now the larger organizations are holding firm. Some of the smaller organizations that had built in a buffer were able to hold firm, but this year will be the most telling year. This is the year that the government's support all sort of fade out of existence, as we all know. All those support systems that were put in place fade out this year. And so charities feel the brunt of that as well. And it's going to be no different in the environmental sector. Interestingly enough, giving was up last year. Donations were up last year. With people staying home, I don't know if it was guilt or a little bit more money in their pockets, but it was me too. My husband and I, we donated more last year than we did the year before. And I'm not quite sure why, but we did. It wasn't a conscious thing. And donations were up across the country. The number of donations were up. The average size of the donation actually went down. And so while there was hope, we were seeing more and more donations come into the environmental sector. The average size of the donation went down. And so there wasn't necessarily a significant increase in money coming in. And with the loss of those foundations and grants, this is the impact that COVID-19 has, that indirect impact. The other piece of COVID-19 is the expectations placed on environmental groups and not-for-profit charities in particular. And as governments cut budgets and reduce and tighten their belts, there is an expectation that organizations, friends of groups, charities, and organizations like Trout Unlimited take on certain roles and responsibilities around restoration, rehabilitations, and protections. Interestingly enough, they're cutting back because they can't spend the money, yet the organizations that are expected to step up and step in and fill in the gaps also don't have the funds to do that. And so we're going to see more and more of that through this coming year, and hopefully it doesn't last much longer than that as a result of the cutbacks being made in other areas because of COVID-19. And then the expectations from the public. And I think this is one of the toughest ones. There is this general feeling that enough isn't being done. And the public tends to look to organizations that are there, like Trout Unlimited Canada, to do something about X problem. Pick a problem. There's a lot of them right now, a lot of them across this country. You guys have got STP issues, we've got coal issues. I mean, there's a long list that goes across this country right now, and it's growing faster than it ever has before. And so the expectation of the general public that groups like Trout Unlimited Canada do something, stand for something, make it change, is a lot. If you consider a conservation organization whose focus is to make positive change on the ground, not advocacy, how do you respond to groups that are very concerned, individuals that want to see significant change? And it's tougher now because people are hurting. And people are hurting mentally and they're hurting emotionally, because we're adding an economic crisis to a pandemic, to an environmental crisis, to God only knows what every individual is dealing with at home. And so it becomes a very emotionally charged issue. I can tell you at our organization, we have dealt with more angry posts and emails than I have seen in my entire career combined. We've seen that in the last 3 months. And it's because people are hurting. And they're feeling hurt not only by their situation, by what's but also by what's happening on the landscape. And that's important to acknowledge. And it's also important to try and find a solution as a community. I'm not saying Trout Unlimited Canada can find the solution, but we're happy to be part of that solution. But it really does take a community approach to solving a lot of these problems. So, sorry, I got to read a comment. I can't do both. Can't talk and read at the same time. Sorry. By advocacy, do you mean political advocacy, or in other words, lobbying? So advocacy by definition by CRA is lobbying of the government, which is political advocacy. They're sort of considered one and the same. Organizations, if you're registered, cannot lobby politically. What I mean by that is by party. So for example, we have a really great relationship with the Alberta government. That doesn't mean that we have a relationship with the party in power at this time, if that makes sense. So it's a very, very different, it's a slightly different beast, I should say. I was also under the assumption that a few years ago, the Income Tax Act changed so that you can, okay. So yes, that you can do an indeterminate amount of advocacy for cases stated in your charitable purpose. Yes and no. So there was a charity that took the standard to court. They won in court. The federal government submitted an appeal. The appeal is still in court. And so technically the rule is that there is an unlimited amount of advocacy right now. If the appeal makes it through, that gets cut back to 10% again. So any charity like Trout Unlimited Canada is taking, that's been in business for a while, is taking the conservative approach. It's been 10%, we're gonna sit with 10% until this is all over. Because in reality, if we move to unlimited advocacy today, trying to rein back in the staff, the members, the chapters back to 10% is impossible. So yes, that is true. We're not convinced it will stay at 10%. The government actually has a solid argument, not to say that we agree with it, but there's a reasonable appeal in place. Does that answer your question, Jordan?
Yeah, and I guess I was kind of leading the witness here, and I think that the last part of my question is is such that I definitely get all that. Sometimes I also think, though, that by definition, conservation is more to protect and retain and keep. And I think that sometimes there's a little bit of a misdefinition with, you know, that restore or rehabilitate. And I guess sometimes I question whether or not we can truly conserve without having an advocacy role. It's a really weird weird dynamic. Yeah.
You're absolutely right, and you can't, which is why that 10% is actually critically important to us. But we also have to honor our mandate and our policies and our values that say our primary role as an organization is to get work done on the ground. We're the only national organization actually getting physical work done on the ground in aquatics in Canada. And that's a niche that needs to be filled. And so, you know, there's that balancing act in what are you legally allowed to do? What should you be doing? And what do your policies, mandate, and priorities say and values say you should be doing? And it's finding that balance. And that's part of the reason we've retained the 10% rule until this is finalized. And then we'll determine as an organization, where do we sit and where do our priorities lie? So, and that's a much bigger discussion for a group like Trout Unlimited Canada, because if we were to switch to 100% advocacy, get rid of our charitable designation, no longer issue receipts, we're no longer a charity, we're now going to become an advocacy group, then who's actually making change on the ground? So who's rehabilitating habitats for endangered species, and who's bringing back threatened populations of species? You know, and I think these are big wins for communities. I mean, bringing brook trout and even American eel back to Lowville Park, back to Bronte Creek, I think that's significant. And that's as significant as changing policy and legislation in my eyes. One definition of conservation states it's a continuum from protection, preservation, and restoration. Yes, absolutely. The question is where you invest in all of those pieces, and just being sure to not make the mistake that conservation is solely advocacy, which is what we're seeing a lot of right now. And again, that steps back to the fact that, you know, people are hurt and people feel they've been lied to, they've been done wrong, that their interests are not being protected. And that's a valid concern, of course. So one other thing I just wanted to talk about that I had in my notes here was around the role of enforcement. And we've had a lot of talks with a lot of groups around the role of enforcement in conservation, preservation, and restoration. And it's interesting because generally speaking, in this sector, we tend to put more pressure on conservation officers than we do on police officers. And in reality, they're very similar in the legislation that they're tied to, the rules and regulations that they have to uphold. But conservation officers have a heck of a lot more space they've got to patrol and a lot more gray zone. And it's interesting because if we think about how we police societies, period, you know, we post speed limits on the 401. And the intent is you're regulating people who follow the rules. That's what you're really doing, right? And do you actually expect there to be enough police officers to ticket everyone who's not doing the speed limit? No, we don't expect that. But somehow in the conservation world, we have a bit of a different impression or expectation of conservation officers, where we expect every poacher to be caught, everyone fishing without a license to be caught. But again, our regulations when it comes to resource use in Canada and hunting and fishing in particular, it's about regulating people who are law-abiding citizens, people who want to do right and people who, you know, want to follow the rules. And the enforcement is there for the people who don't. And the hope is that you are able to deter enough of them through charges and through fines that you reduce that proportion. The reality is you never reduce it to zero. We're never going to see everyone doing 100 clicks on the 401. I live there. There's no way. It's not happening. But you hope that you reduce it. And so you reduce it to the point where you're not having a dramatic negative impact on the resource. But in reality, it's impossible for conservation officers, federal fisheries officers to be everywhere they need to be. And court cases and getting convictions is a lot more difficult for conservation officers and federal fisheries officers than it is in any other realm in law enforcement. And so that creates a significant problem. But just as is the case when we're talking about speeding on the 401 or erratic driving, we also have a responsibility. And how many people here have actually called in a drunk driver or called in an erratic driver? Has anyone ever called 911 and reported that? Yeah, so a few people have. I have, absolutely. So we've got, half dozen people that have reported it. How many people have actually reported a poacher or someone fishing without a license? I got 2, 3. Yeah, so document, record, report. We can do that. We have the capability of doing that. There is also precedent set now for sharing Facebook feeds and Facebook posts. There was a post of a gentleman riding or driving his, I think it was a Ford F-150, might have been, it was a pickup truck, riding through a stream, muddying it up against Federal Fisheries Act, against a few different acts. But somebody took a photograph and you can see the license plate, and that person was charged. He posted it on Facebook. Somebody posted it on Facebook. So the gentleman who posted it was not the gentleman who reported it. Somebody posted it, you could see the license plate, someone else shared it, and that person was charged. So we do have a role we can play with enforcement as well. We never ever encourage anyone going up to an angler and educating them, or educating them strongly, let's say, or necessarily telling folks they're wrong. But you can document and report, and I think you would be surprised how many times those reports are actually beneficial to the resource, in that charges are laid, or at least people are at a minimum warned. Does Trout Unlimited Canada see value in community tree planting events along waterways? Absolutely, every day of the week. Just plant them in the right place and right side up, please. I have seen it. I've seen things planted sideways on point bars, gravel bars that get flooded in the right place with native species, absolutely. Plantings, they improve air quality, reduce air temperature, they reduce water temperature, well known to provide great benefit in the food web in aquatic systems. And you cannot diminish the value of getting the community together and making some change and doing some good in the environment. So absolutely, every day of the week, it is a good thing to do. Do charges have to go through a particular ministry? No, just report. They'll figure out what ministry. I've seen reportings of things like poaching and fishing without poaching, both hunting and fishing without a fishing license, and also disposal of hazardous chemicals that went through MOE at the time. They will figure out, just call a phone number, call whatever number you've got on hand, report it. They will figure out where that information is best sent. I think we've got that. Yeah, and Jack points out that most provinces have a report a poacher line, and a lot of them will accept reports of acts other than poaching as well. I know in Alberta they accept calls on OHVs in water, which is not a poaching issue, but they'll accept calls. And if it's an issue that they don't deal with directly, they'll either forward it on or they'll tell you what phone number to call to get it addressed, for sure. Okay, let's feel free to take your computers, phones, tablets off mute and ask questions.
Yeah, the middle ground in Ontario got they became exceptional waters. They got a classification as exceptional waters. How do they manage that? How do they go about that? What is the procedure? Why can't all waters be exceptional?
That's a really good question, actually. And you know what? Jack was involved in the Exceptional Waters program, so I might actually ask him. I know you're off duty here, Jack, but would you mind answering that?
Absolutely. Can everybody hear me? It was actually one of my programs that I worked with. It was Jack Simpson with Fly Fishing Canada that came up and suggested we should be doing something to identify waters of exceptional value. Now, the project started actually as a PhD project with Ryan Plummer at the University of Guelph with John Fitzgibbon, myself, and a few others. And that was to identify how we could create areas that had exceptional value so that people saw the best part of their watershed and saw it as a goal for the rest of their watershed. So this was not the Middle Grand chapter working on. This was actually a project looking at 3 watersheds, the Grand, the Maitland, and the Saugeen. Unfortunately, but a short time into the program on the Saugeen, Walkerton happened, and people were a bit too busy dealing with that crisis to want to get involved in a community-based environmental program. But on the Maitland, we have the Friends of the Lower Maitland, which has now created programs to better protect the Lower Maitland. And on the Grand, the GRCA worked with us and with MNR to create a section of water that was protected both from our angling regulation as well as with getting the community involved in advocating for better environmental protection. And that included not just anglers, but hunters, naturalists, canoeists, and landowners as well. So the program actually started in 2001. But it's still going on. It's been recognized. We are hoping as a province, I was hoping as a province that we would create a program for other water to create other waters, but we never got a good push from the province.
And I think, unfortunately, now the politics are not quite aligned with having that push forward at this stage. I'm hoping it's something that we can bring back. But, you know, thinking nationally, what we're trying to figure out at TU is how do we identify key watersheds, key sections of watersheds nationally that every Canadian should be concerned about. Because I think there's a value as we start looking further up, as we start sort of broadening our gaze at the resources we have available to us. At some point in time as a society, we're going to start thinking nationally. We want to get ahead of that. And how do we identify key watersheds that Canadians need to see protected? So, you know, we've got programs like that. We've got the Heritage Rivers system. There's a number of different classifications for rivers in different regions of Canada. I think there's a value in setting the stage for something national, maybe rolling up the Exceptional Waters program to the national level. And maybe we don't need to wait for the government to do that. Maybe that's something that TUC will take on just as we're trying to evaluate how we approach that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the US, they have the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which actually has teeth. The Canadian Heritage Rivers program has no teeth whatsoever.
Yeah.
It has no, even if you've designated as a heritage river, there is no legislation, there are no policies, there are no guidelines to have anybody do anything other than to celebrate the fact that they have the designation. Whereas in the US, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act actually has teeth and does a job at protecting important watersheds.
Yeah, and that's what we really need is protections, right?
Yeah.
So is there actually legislation that protects exceptional waters?
Nope. We should have some, but we don't.
No, there isn't. There isn't, unfortunately, and you know, I think one of the big wins that that we've got coming now is with Environment Canada moving to Environment Canada and climate change, and the creation of what's the new water group, Jack? I just drew a blank.
Canada Water Agency.
Thank you. The Canada Water Agency that's being not proposed, being created. I think this is going to be the first real win for protection of waters in Canada. That's been a big gap, a shocking gap. Ever since I was in university, I couldn't understand for the life of me why we didn't protect. There was no legislation protecting water in Canada, water quality, water flow, nothing. And so I think this is the first really big step for us as Canadians in having protections on water. And then the next step is how do we identify those critical systems or critical areas within systems and afford them additional protections.
Can I ask a question for Silvia? Thank you for speaking with the club. Is there a a particular river, let's say here in Southern Ontario, that might be a case of focusing Trout Unlimited's efforts in the next like 5 years that is under stress, under pressure? I'm sure there's many, of course, across the country, but
a long list in Southern Ontario. There's a long list.
Is there one particular that is particularly stressed or threatened, or that would be a good focus river?
I don't think I could commit to one. The main reason being is the changes in regulations in Ontario, the loss of protections that we saw through the loss of some of the teeth for conservation authorities, that was significant, is going to put a lot of watersheds at risk, I believe, or could put a lot of watersheds at risk. In addition, understanding how the landscape is going to change in the next short while with regards to growth and development is kind of unclear. So, as I mentioned, politics is changing, development is changing, how Ontario is approaching industry and environment is changing dramatically. So it's really hard to tell. I think a lot of Southern Ontario rivers and streams are at a bit of a tipping point where we've seen an improvement over time. We've seen the Grand River improve over time. We've seen the Credit River improve over time. We've seen a lot of these systems respond positively to all the investment and work that's happened. And I'd like to say we should move on to other watersheds and make the same investment, but part of me is looking back at those watersheds and saying, well, we already knew there was still more to do, but now there's going to be additional stressors on them. My bigger concern is that the stressors and loss of protections are leading to a situation where groups like ours, like yours, like other volunteer organizations will not have the ability to keep up. It's a slide we can't keep up with. We couldn't keep up before. We thought we had a hope. We thought we had a chance. We definitely can't keep up now. And that's not just the case in Ontario. I'm sure you all heard about the coal issues in Alberta, gravel pit mining in Alberta. There's a lot of issues across the country. I think of greatest concern to me is Alberta and Ontario, just in the change in politics and change in legislation. So I don't think I could pick one. I have grave concerns about all of Southern Ontario and the potential slide to a very negative situation after all the investment. Sorry.
Yeah,
so work on
Silvia,
all of them. That's my
Silvia,
news. Work on all of them. Yes.
Unfortunately, I think we have to take off our waders and put on hobnail boots and kick some political ass. But I honestly don't know how we can get onto the politicians and really make a difference in their attitude. The only way we can do it is at the ballot box, and that takes 4 years at a time, and the damage is already done.
It's not the only way. I'll be honest, it isn't the only way. So it's important first that every single Canadian have their voice heard before the ballot box. Make your voice heard, however you're comfortable doing so. Some people are signing petitions, some people are signing letters, some people are setting up meetings. You have to make your voice heard in a way that you feel comfortable. If the issue is significant enough to you, you do not have to wait till the ballot box. This is part of what I was going to talk about in what TUC is doing. So we've made a choice in our limited our limited advocacy resource budget, in people time and all of those pieces, to decide. We've decided to spend that time in working with governments. Instead of trying to oppose governments in what they're doing, how do we work with governments to realize change at the policy and legislative level? We're working on meetings with the Ontario government. They've been a little tough to connect with. We just recently got meetings with ministers in the Alberta government, and we've been invited to work with them on the development of new legislation for protections in the foothills. So we're going to take that opportunity and walk down that road. As long as a government agency is willing to work with us productively and talk with us, we're going to continue down that road in an effort to gain protections. And in particular, protections in sensitive habitats. And so that's the route that we're taking and other groups are taking. And I think in reality, there has to be a public sentiment that's out there that says something. And so if everyone is opposed to something happening, that has to be said. At the same time, there needs to be groups or organizations working with the government that can take advantage of that pressure and say, here's the change we need to realize to make everyone happy and realize positive change on the landscape. So, you know, I think I'm not waiting till ballot box, I'll tell you that. Although, you know what, the ballot box is a strong incentive as well and is a strong message, but I don't think we have to wait to that point. Politicians lead by following. We need to engage our neighbors and communities and push for our concerns. So I'll tell you the message from us is we encourage everyone to educate themselves. So we will never tell you what to say or how to say it, but we will tell you there is an issue. Educate yourself, decide what your concern is if you have one, and decide if you feel comfortable making yourself heard. And in the end, we do believe that if everyone saw the same information we did, the majority of people would come to the same conclusion. That we have an issue on the landscape and that this issue is going to hurt us in the long run. It's going to hurt our kids and it's going to hurt our grandkids, and it's not acceptable. And so, you know, it's important that we get that message heard, and it's important that we invest in organizations that can have a seat at that table and realize that change. Trout Unlimited Canada has been at the table developing policy and legislation for decades. Jack and I really enjoyed it. It's a great process, but it's necessary. And you know, it's what we need to see. It's what we need to have as a critical tool in the long-term protections. Parties come and go and governments cycle through, but the hope is that that legislation and that policy is what sticks. And that's what we need to develop. And the other important thing for the organizations that have access, you know, like Trout Unlimited Canada, when we do have access to a government, I think it's important that we utilize that relationship. Because if I speak to the coal issue out here, and the number of potential coal pits and open pit gravel extraction, all the extraction that they're talking about here, are we best spent trying to battle each and every one, or are we best spent going to the Alberta government and saying, there's a problem. There are gaps in the protections. Here's the evidence of it. We need to close the gaps. And when the government says, if you see gaps, we're committed to closing it. Let's work on that together. That is the bigger win in our mind. Instead of battling each and every effort to have an open pit extraction of some sort. And so that's the route we take. But at the same time, you need to have that groundswell of support for protection. Make sense? There's a definite place for legal advocates. Absolutely, there's no doubt about that. And there are organizations and universities actually engaged at the legal level as well. So, you know, make no mistake, a multitude of tactics is what is absolutely necessary to see change on the ground. And that's what you want to see happening. I actually have a meeting coming up with some folks from the University of Calgary. Their legal department is reviewed changes in legislation. So, you know, that's good news. There are a lot of allies out there, and everyone can play a role. And the trick is you don't want everyone playing the same role, but you want everyone playing a role, whatever role they're comfortable with. So I'm going to give you 3 terms that I tend to use a lot of. So let me, Jack, don't laugh at me. Let me give you 3 terms. This is a big question, and I like it. Thank you. 3 terms that I use just so that I can define them right now. Native. So naturally existing in its own home region. So a brook trout may be native in Ontario, not native in Alberta, right? Yep. So native. Naturalized is a non-native species that's been brought in but now reproduces on its own. And then non-native or introduced is a species that is stocked in and has to be stocked repeatedly. So Trout Unlimited Canada has a policy around stocking and around native species. And the priority for our organization, and again, this is Trout Unlimited Canada's priority. We're not saying this should be everyone's priority, but Trout Unlimited Canada's priority falls first and foremost on the protection of native species in their native range, in their home range. And if you actually have a look across this country, I can't think of a single native species that isn't hurting right now. That isn't, pretty much all of them are actually in dire straits. I mean, brook trout are declining at a rate 20% more than we thought that they would in Southern Ontario. That's of grave concern. trying to keep up with that loss is going to be significant. The same holds true for cutthroat trout, same holds true for Atlantic salmon, obviously cutthroat trout in the west, Atlantic salmon in the east, all in their home ranges. Yeah. In addition to that, though, we have naturalized species. And listen, those of you who know me, and I know a few of you do, I enjoy my steelheading. As a matter of fact, it's probably the biggest thing I missed since moving to Alberta. I miss steelheading, something fierce. And there is a role for naturalized populations, right? They're already there. Eradicating a species, especially a non-native species, we know just doesn't work. It's near impossible. We haven't been very successful at that. Eradicating native species, we've gotten pretty good at, but non-native, we haven't gotten very good at. And so they're there. But they also hold social economic value. And so there is value in that. And having fisheries that are non-native takes pressure away from those native populations as well. There was a really, really great program done in Northern Ontario. They picked a number of lakes, 20 some odd lakes, I think, and they stocked them. And they produced a book you could buy for $14, I'll never forget it. And it had, bathymetric maps, here's the boat launch, here's how many fish we stock in. We stock them in every year. Here's the best fishing spots. Here's the size that gets stocked. Here's the temperature of the lake, best lures, best fishing spots, every piece of information you can imagine. And they basically put these number of lakes up as sacrifice to remove pressure from natural populations that were hurting. And it did work. It did make a big, big difference. So there's a value in naturalized populations. And then you have the stocked populations, these non-native populations that are continually stocked. Again, there's value there. So if you think about, some of the pothole lakes in the prairies, these are lakes that are either aerated or continually stocked. They provide recreational opportunities, social and economic value, removing pressure from non-natives. Again, where it gets dicey and where it gets awfully dangerous is the overlap between them. And so as soon as we have non-native populations or non-native species overlapping with native, typically it's the native species that loses out. And that's partially because they're not just dealing with competition with non-natives, they're also dealing with loss of habitat, warming temperature, loss of food, a litany of problems and stressors that they're already dealing with. And a lot of times it's just too much. And when you add in that non-native, on top of all of that, it's impossible for them to keep hold. Now, there is a lot of interest and a lot of push towards using stocking to supplement native species. From Trout Unlimited Canada's perspective, the science does not support that. So what we have seen is the best return, the best investment that you can make in the long-term stability of a native population is habitat improvement and protections. These are the biggest things you can do. In Lowville Park, we never stocked in brook trout. We did habitat rehabilitation and we walked away. And within 6 months, brook trout moved into the area. And now anglers are constantly going there for brook trout. And American eel moved into the area, spawning in the area. Never recorded in Bronte Creek, assumed to have been there, and then never used the creek again. So, the best investment we can make is in that habitat rehabilitation and in protections of habitat and protections of zones for native species. When you stock on top of a native species, and stocking isn't one thing, it's not just breeding in a hatchery and putting them in. There's a continuum of techniques within stocking. Everything from the Heinz 57 mix, I forget the name of that stock. It was basically a brook trout from all over the range, all mixed together, and they produced this stock. And we lovingly called it the Heinz 57 mix. And those fish were stocked out. There was another stock, the Nipigon stock, that was taken from Lake Nipigon, and a brood stock was created. And these animals get stocked out. Then you go to, like I said, a continuum of techniques. There's also been work done. I was involved with the Aurora trout where eggs and gametes were taken from males and females and combined and eyed up in the hatchery and brought to an age and then taken out of the hatchery. And so you don't have that constant generation over generation. One generation is crossed and put into the waterway. And then all the way to the opposite side of the spectrum, and there's a ton of different techniques, opposite side of the spectrum, which is actually transplants. And at Trout Unlimited Canada, we've done that, where you have a river. We did this on Mill Creek. where down in Taquania, where the river was devoid of brook trout. We were able to do a significant amount of habitat work. There was groundwater upwelling. It was prime. By the time that chapter and those volunteers were done, that area was prime for brook trout. If there was ever a place you were going to see brook trout, it was going to be there. But there were no brook trout to be found. And so we found the closest neighboring population that was healthy and literally transplanted fish and allowed them to reproduce on their own. So there's a broad spectrum of techniques, and we tend to err on the, please don't touch the fish. Let's do habitat first. Okay, they're not coming back. What's the next least invasive thing we can do? Because again, Mother Nature is much better at this than we are. And so the least amount of work that we can do to impact the genetics of that population is what we're interested in as an organization. I haven't done that stalking question in a while, thanks. Other questions before I talk a little bit about what Trout Unlimited Canada is doing?
I think, Sylvia,
Yes.
could you just point out to everybody the difference between Trout Unlimited and Trout Unlimited Canada, because there's a financial difference.
Oh, there's a big difference, yes. Trout Unlimited is US, Trout Unlimited Canada, go figure, is us. And the two organizations are not the same and not connected in any way. So Trout Unlimited in the US, which is Trout Unlimited, period, has a slightly different mandate and a slightly different way of doing things. And in Canada, Trout Unlimited Canada, again, as an independent organization, we share in name only. We, again, have, I think, a little conservation mandate. They're focused more on the conservation of fisheries. We're focused on the conservation of aquatic systems. Not to say they don't do habitat work, they absolutely do. But just it's a slight, but in my mind, significant difference in focus. And unlike Ducks Unlimited, there is no flow of funds across the border. There's no connection between the two organizations.
And you have a little project on the go now to raise funds. You mentioned that in an email.
Yeah, we've got an interesting one on the go. A number of fly tyers have gotten together and volunteered their time to raise money for Trout Unlimited Canada. And it's called Tying for Conservation. And if you make a charitable donation through these web pages that these tyers have set up to the organization, you do get a tax receipt for it, then they invite you to a live tying session. Actually, my session is tomorrow night, so no pressure, guys. But I'll be tying the Soggy Bog tomorrow night, and some of you have seen that fly, some of you have fished that fly effectively, and some of you have tied that fly. Nationally, we're most active, as you guys well know, in Ontario and Alberta, as that's where our offices are. But what's really interesting is with COVID, we haven't slowed down. So we had a few projects deferred from last year. We had a small window where we had to defer some projects, but we've got more going on the ground than we ever have. And that is with COVID protocols in place. So there are a number of restoration and rehabilitation projects on the go, and a number of dam removals being proposed in Ontario that should be good, and a number of culvert projects. We're very much focused on the protection of habitat for native and endangered species right now. We're doing a lot of work in Alberta for bull trout. If anyone comes out here when we're allowed to travel again, give me a call. We'll show you some bull trout. And if you like fishing native trout, you got to see these guys. They are a very impressive animal and a beautiful animal. They've certainly won me over, not quite as much as brook trout, but close. And so we're doing a lot of work on research and protection for native species. You've probably seen the Bring Back the Brookies program that's expanded in Ontario, again, very much focusing on protection of brook trout and habitats that house brook trout or could house brook trout. And we're also doing a number of habitat restoration projects where we may have overlap with non-native species, but we're hopeful that if we can optimize the habitat for native species, and that if conditions continue to improve from a water quality and habitat perspective, that we could reach a point where native species could outcompete the non-native species. And so we are doing work in areas where we see overlap to hopefully realize those gains over time. Other than that, as I mentioned, we're actively involved in, especially in Alberta, hopefully soon in Ontario with the provincial government to make additions and changes with policy and legislation for protections. And we are getting active with the federal government as well on protections in particular for water quality and hopefully through the federal stimulus package on protections to help buffer systems against climate change. Because the one thing we haven't talked about is climate change, and that's still there. And it's still a significant issue. So we want to make sure that we don't, again, create a new crisis in the wake of the existing crisis. So generally speaking, that's what we're up to, besides some really creative fundraisers and ways to connect with the community. And besides some of the other fun things that we're posting on Instagram and Facebook and all our social media feeds, that's pretty much what we're up to in a nutshell.